All right. Thank you very much. So we'll start right now. So I want to start with just a few things from the last week because they are very relevant to the same today's class. Just like a refresher. First of all, we try to understand what resistance means, especially for the Black population, where we drew from some. Yeah, everyone, people shared you guys shared your own understanding and which are very, very correct and relevant. Just like I talked about in an elephant, assuming a blind person touches an elephant, so they would describe the elephant based on the aspect that they touch. If they touch the ear, they could see it as a fan, or even the any parts could be described in a different way. So that's just me trying to say that we all have a good idea of what it means to resist or what Black resistance means. So, and very importantly, it was nice to hear some persons also highlight that aspect of continuity. It's an ongoing process. It's multidimensional. It's expressed in different ways, in different places, and different people adopt different approaches to express their resistance or how they want to resist a system, whether an oppressive system or a system that may not be in a favorable way to the population or to the community or even to the individual. Because resistance also can be seen both from the granular level as well as from a more holistic or collective level. So, so I also wanted to touch on just a refresher about the ABC of resistance framework, where we talked about the avoidance or everyday resistance. We also noted the breaking resistance as well as the constructive resistance, where the avoidance or everyday resistance simply means a kind of quiet and subtle ways of resisting, where it could be in the form of feigning illness or trying to drag one's foot or kind of doing work in a lazy way, or even being passive, or even using sarcasm to express oneself. And these are some some of the things that one can use to. These are things that people tend to apply in their everyday interaction with, whether in the workplace or with authority or with systems. And then the other one, the breaking resistance, which is the more radical aspect of resistance, which is more confrontational, which is like trying to publicly express oneself in like disobeying authority, or it could be in the form of non-cooperation or interventions, like examples that we have in like protests. We see people picketing, we see people strikes, civil disobedience, where people these are approaches that are applied commonly that are very overt, as well as you can see roadblocks can be mounted in a bid to obstruct traffic or obstruct the proper functioning of the society, just to get the attention of the people in authority. And then there could be consumer boycotts or outright revolutions. And then the third one, which is the constructive resistance, basically deals with kind of creating alternatives to the mainstream systems in a bid to resist a system that is unfavorably for a Black community. I have these examples um, of the historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. So that's an alternative system that is created. Oh, this is an institution that we believe would effectively represent the Blacks in the case of the United States. And one of the guest speakers that we'll have is a graduate of Howard University from the US, and which we also understand the root of Howard University. And so bringing some of those lenses from their experiences in the institution and their practice would be very useful, because the training is, the place of training, whether the university, the colleges, etc., they are places where we are formed, where our professional identity and where we are trained and nurtured. into becoming who we will become eventually in practice. Okay, Kemi, please go on. You have a question, please go on. Yeah, I forgot
Yes.
that you were here last week, so please go on.
Thanks, Dr. Oko. I was just wondering, so under which umbrella would we place Black joy? Because we know that Black joy is a form of resistance. Would that be constructive then? Just the idea of um, we refuse to be, we want to continue to be joyful, our situation nonetheless.
Yeah,
So, okay, thanks.
go on. Please go on. I thought you were done. Please go on.
Yeah, I'm done. I was just wondering, where do we place Black joy?
Okay, yeah. So these are every part. It is a part of the everyday resistance. So that's the everyday resistance or avoidance resistance, because these are things that we do in a subtle way in our everyday interactions with the system. So it falls under the everyday resistance. Just like
Oh,
one could choose to be disloyal to, uh, let's say, their boss that may be kind of racist, for instance, or trying not to perform their duties, trying to malinger, etc. These are everyday sort of resistance or
okay.
avoidance
Okay.
resistance. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. So, so we're gonna talk about what we have talked about last, because of time. So we're gonna talk about the Afrocentric and Western methods of healthcare as complementary and legitimate ways of healing. So basically, we'll start with the Masibo paper that talks about a kind of frameworks or time points or periods for analysis of uh, um, black in this case, not just black but basically focused on Africa. They drew this from the lens of the East African, Southern African, and Central African lens. So trying to understand or unpack how scholars and analysts have interpreted health and healing and diseases in in that particular context from an Afrocentric lens. So basically there are 5 time periods, and these time periods also coincides with a framework of analysis of a way of trying to understand and unpack what health, healing, and diseases mean. So the first time period is the constitutional or lens. First lens is the colonial institutional histories. So basically, this basically talks about, yeah, the researchers or the scholars that have tried to understand what health, healing, and diseases mean in the African context. They've adopted this position that the missionaries and the colonial medical professionals or officials that they came to Africa on a rescue mission. They came to do us a favor. It was based on the assumption that Africans did not have a proper method of or healing um, approach or medical approach or healthcare approach. So that's the kind of assumption that they came with. Yeah, yeah. The missionaries, they came into this context. They came into this primitive environment, these primitive people, and they introduced new technologies, new ways of healing, new approaches in a bid to heal, in a bid to help, in a bid to rescue, in a bid to help these helpless people. So that's a paternalistic, that's a one-sided, that's an unbalanced way of looking at health as the agency and the competence of the African people within their context. That's that assumption simply tells us that, oh, without the coming of the Europeans or the colonialists or colonizers, that Africans aren't capable of providing healthcare, of healing themselves. But however, an interesting perspective to this is that was like an argument by the ecological that after this time period, after the 1950s and 1960s, then during the 1970s, which where the ecological histories came into bear, these ones they argued that, oh, really, these Europeans they came to disrupt the equilibrium that we had healing approaches, that we had diseases that were endemic. However, they came and these diseases turned into an epidemic proportion. They disrupted the balance between the biological system and the environmental systems. So that means we might have been, or we would have been better off, the Africans would have been better off if the Europeans hadn't intervened or interfered in their environment, in their space, and in their affairs. That's the argument from the ecological history analyst. On the other hand, from the 1980s, the political economic histories now brings in the neoliberal market logic, brings up how the capitalist market system influence health of the African peoples in the in the sub-Saharan African region. So there are examples of like, oh, some persons were some of the black workers, colonized people. Some of them were sent when they were sick, they were sent back to their homes or to their communities without proper care. And then eventually this perpetuates a system where some of them will not receive adequate care, where they also, if they had an infectious disease, they spread the disease. If they're in a very poor state of health, they may not receive good care and they would eventually become casualties in some instances. So everything was profit driven. We also understand this coincided with the era of the neoliberalism during the period where Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Great Britain or the United Kingdom. Also, Ronald Reagan from the US. These are some of the key figures from the political space that were prominent for advancing the neoliberal market policies. And eventually, apart from the political space, even from the academic space, these ideas were also prominent. They were also pervasive. So then after the 1980s, there were also people who also analyzed from the 1990s using the discourse analysis histories lens. So eventually these ones were trying to understand health of Africans from the lens of the medical practitioners who were largely European or Westernized. So they try to understand what does even healthcare for this population? How do we understand healthcare? What are the accounts of healthcare in the African continent? How do they understand health? What were their experiences of healthcare in this space? So eventually they had their own views, which actually omitted or did not factor in the experiences, the views, the voices of the Africans themselves. So it was still an unbalanced narrative, an unbalanced way of analyzing and understanding health and healthcare in this region. And then from 1990s up and also in 2000s onwards, the socio-cultural histories now came to bear as well, where we began to this sociocultural view now be integrated and brought a more balanced view where both the African and Eurocentric Afrocentric and Eurocentric ways of analyzing and understanding health and healthcare, healing and diseases. That's when it became that's when it became a public and mainstream discourse where analysts began to utilize, oh, the Eurocentric views are important. Nonetheless, the African views are also important. They argue that, yeah, we cannot understand health without also considering how the Africans themselves and the Europeans also can help us to have a more holistic or a more comprehensive way of studying, interpreting, and applying healthcare and the technologies and all whatnot. So just like we can't talk about us without us. No, sorry, what is something?
Sorry, you were saying who can help us with holistic ways of researching health?
No.
Wait, what were sorry, you're
Okay, yeah. So the social culture now try to integrate both the Eurocentric and Afrocentric ways of understanding, studying, and practicing health and healthcare. Yeah, because a priori, the African views, apart from the ecological, that we are like, oh, the Eurocentric views, we are totally, they disrupted the balance. We had something good going on. We understood our environment, even our way of agriculture and veterinary practice, or or rearing animals, planting seeds, healing ourselves, hygiene, etc. That we had a balance before, where the biological system and the environmental system were at a somewhat equilibrium, and we took care of ourselves in our natural African cultural means. That we had this traditional healing strategy, whereas the Europeans then came with the Eurocentric views and disrupted what we had going on where for us. But the social cultural believes that, oh, there is some validity to the Eurocentric, and as well as the Afrocentric technologies and ideas and practices or approaches to health and healthcare.
And those are coming from Africans as well.
Yeah, Africans and Europe, yeah, both African and Europeans. So, but this is out of resistance from more authors, both African authors and non-African authors, even non-African allies were also helping in furthering this narrative. But yeah, Africans were also very prominent, prominent roles in.
Yes, would you see solely Afrocentric voices? I know like there are some scholars that are just solely about African voices, you know, dictating our health systems and how we define health literacy. So where would you see just those African voices, not like the mixture or integration of both?
Yeah, I was the ecological history is trying to accentuate the African voices. They argue that these ones were, that's what they particularly wanted to do, that the European views were not helping us. They were disruptive, and they had disastrous implications for us. So that means we should just stick to our Afrocentric ways of doing things, of healing, of understanding healthcare, of relating and delivering healthcare to and even the environment in total, ensuring that we use Africa-based Afrocentric healthcare, and not because they talked about even sanitation and all whatnot. So that's where we'll find that view that no, we should stick to African ways of doing things, African ways of trying to understand diseases, African ways of trying to organize our environments, of maintaining good hygiene, of delivering or preparing therapeutic programs or interventions. So that's where it fell. But there was so much emphasis on the environment. That's why about that balance between the environmental and the biological system. Is that clear? Okay, you're welcome. So, but the sociocultural now, which is more modern, close to our contemporary time and up to our contemporary time, basically brought that idea of, oh yeah, these two approaches, there are some benefits to them. Yeah, we shouldn't necessarily discard or one of them. We should find a way to utilize them, find a balance between both. So we're talking about what is culturally appropriate for Africans, but nevertheless, there are some ways that we can adapt the Eurocentric ways into the African system, and ways we can also integrate the African system into the Eurocentric medicine, orthodox medicine. Any question? Okay. All right. So then about the African indigenous healing practices, going more from just a historical analysis to talking about exactly what are those basic things, what are those granular details of how can we exemplify what we just learned from the first paper? How can we flesh out what we just learned? The surface level analysis, how can we go with fine details to understand this when we talk about African traditional healing methods and how we can integrate it with the Eurocentric methods. So basically, but there was the argument that, yeah, that even Africa's approach, the erosion of the Afrocentric approach can be associated with, there are some factors that have resulted to the erosion of the Afrocentric approach, making it no more mainstream, making it no more mainstream, such as the continent was believed to have been ravaged by incessant wars, where there were tribal wars, because I believe some of you would have also read about some of the histories of some African tribal groups or ethnic groups, inter-tribal wars. So there are some historians that talked about, yeah, when they came to Africa, they met a people who were so disorganized and fighting wars. That obviously that's an unfair way of describing the situation for sure. Because even in the European context, they had wars, even the Normans and there were countless wars. Even the English and the French had their battles, the Spanish, the requisitions and other sort of wars that happened in medieval Europe. You want to say something?
But the issue is when you hear about these African warfare, whatever,
Yeah.
it's become homogenized toward the point of that they're all African, different, no difference between the tribes and whatnot. When that's usually coming from Eurocentric views, where when they're all white themselves, they were still able to separate themselves as Germanic or French or something.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. Yeah, for sure. But nonetheless, but they believe that the argument here is that because of the commotion, because of the battles and everything, so they met they met a place, they met an environment where that was chaotic, where people were in continuous wars or battles with each other. And obviously, when there is no peace, there will be little or no progress.
Sorry, I just have a question for like points 1 to 4.
Yeah.
Could it be argued that those are just like byproducts of colonization? Because even with the, apologize, for the warfare that we're talking about for Rwanda, the Hutus and Tutsis,
Yeah.
like although there's like pre-colonial times they had issues, but it was exacerbated by, the Germans. So that all of those are still like byproducts of colonization. Same thing with the second and I would say the third.
Yeah, you have a very good point, but nonetheless, that does not we should not discount the fact that even African tribes or ethnic groups also had their wars even before the European or colonialist influence. So there were also wars, and the actual colonization itself actually happened after the Berlin Conference, 1884 and 85. That was when the actual real colonial control happened in Africa. But before then, there were also wars and battles in the continent a priori. Just like we also had in Europe, there were also wars and between different groups or different European identities. So all those things existed. So very funny enough, someone argued that the scramble for Africa was what united Europe. I don't know if you had something like that before. Yeah, because they were also themselves in constant wars and battles. Even up to the present day, there are still wars between some European groups or current countries right now. They still exist. But nonetheless, my point is that, yeah, although this is argued to be one of the rationales for having for Africa being underdeveloped in terms of not being able to organize themselves, but it was not peculiar to Africa.
But organize themselves, but who's them? In this case, Africans being themselves. That's so broad that in this case, who would it be?
Yeah,
Because if we look at it pre-colonially,
yeah,
here they had foreign tribes, but then they also had flourishing empires.
yeah. Like I knew about the Songhai Empire, and Mali Empire.
Zimbabwe.
Yeah, there are several empires for sure.
So then when we look at it after colonialism, you have borders that are
Yeah.
different groups were never together culturally, traditionally, none of that. It's not like they were forced to organize themselves under that like capitalist structure.
Yeah, and that's why I also said that, yeah, that it was unfair to utilize this as an excuse for Africa not having a thriving healthcare system. Although that's not 100% correct, because based on the technology of those days, they had the competent way of healing themselves. They have what they were perceived to be competent in providing care for themselves. Even the asylum system of providing care for people with psychiatric or mental health issue problems, it has colonialist roots, and the asylum system is not a decent system of providing mental health care for sure. So there are ways that we can also argue that, yeah, despite Africa not having a perfect system as at then, but it was not peculiar to Africa for sure. It's just that because of Africa was eventually subjugated, so whoever tells the story can choose to advance their own agenda and paint it the narrative in a way that fits what they want the image they want to create and what they want to achieve. Yeah. So part of the arguments about, yeah, that Africa had no arts and sciences. However, some scholars refute this idea that, yeah, Africa had their system, even when it comes to the healing, let's say the plants and the animals that are used for therapeutic purposes. You can also notice that the traditional healers, they knew what to extract, they knew what some of these extras could do, they knew what could be used to, let's say, to cure a stomach ailment or other sort of conditions. For instance, the mud cat fish and other items were also used for instance, for stomach pains, and there are some other remedies that were used for different ailments or different conditions. So invariably, Africa had ability, or what should I call it, the technology as at those days to provide care, certain sort of kind of care. So, however, let me just to go further. There are some challenges that the critiques of the Afrocentric healing methods had. Part of the critiques was about, yeah, some of the practices were perceived to be fetish, like the rituals that they did. There were some rituals, some sacrifices, and they were also observing some taboos. You can imagine maybe you might want to consult the gods. Then we want to maybe kill a fowl to perform some as a form of ritual before administering the actual intervention. So that practice was seen as fetish, was seen as something that isn't appealing and should be rejected.
So, but when we're talking about challenges
Oh,
of African indigenous.
yeah, exactly. So the challenge is, yeah, exactly. These are the things that the proponents or should I say the antagonistic views, these were the arguments that they had.
That Europeans have.
Yeah, exactly. So not just Europeans right now, because even some of these views are held by Africans themselves
For pre-Christianity or after Christianity?
till date.
Pardon?
Till date. Pre and till date. So there, for instance, I've talked about Africans being seen as primitive, disorganized, and needing help, just like I talked about the colonial institutional histories way of seeing that, yeah, we came to rescue on a rescue mission for these people. They are too primitive, they can't fend for themselves. If we don't intervene, they may probably not last long or not survive. And things like life expectancy for sure. We also understand that the low life expectancy as at then was not peculiar to Africa. Even in Europe, the life expectancy was not that high compared to the present day anyway, which is part of the good, the wonderful things that we appreciate about the present day technological advancements and advances in healthcare. So, but nonetheless, these are some of the issues that were prominent. Then apart from that, the fetish ways, the supposed fetish ways of doing things, there was also perception that the traditional healers they lack adequate knowledge of the compositions of they use extracts from, let's say, from fish, from plants, and even other animals. However, unlike present-day medicine that is able to distill the individual, the granular or basic components of these items, they're able to understand, yeah, this particular active agent contained in this let's say in the fish, for instance, that this particular active agent can do this. However, there might be some other components of that extract that may be if not poisonous, but not very good, or maybe can also be removed or extracted differently for another purpose. So, but then, even right up to the present day, if you understand about herbal medicine, etc., up to today, one part of the arguments against these herbal drugs, like common in the African context right now, is that they are not well purified, they are not we're not able to actually extract some elements and leave out some elements that may not offer the same good. But the normal orthodox pharmacological system is able to extract and separate certain items and use certain active agents for, let's say, for healing malaria or healing other conditions. You want to say something, Susan?
But I think that argument can really be fought with the fact that many of the drugs provided by pharmaceutical companies have an array of side effects
Yeah.
because of the added compounds that they're adding to it that are causing even more harm to the human body in the long term,
Yeah.
or causing other ailments and diseases because of the side effects that these drugs have. So when I hear the argument of homeopathic medicine or herbal medicine not being as effective or not having the same potency or all of these things, I think that it cannot be compared because they are built in different ways and they are different ways of medicine to my perspective, because the herbal medicine, I think before it is prescribed to someone, there is a more of a holistic view of the person, where with the pharmaceutical aspect, it's really like one aspect at a time, and disregards the whole, complete person, and they don't really take into account the side effects of these person. Like, let's say someone that has a heart condition right now, it ends up suffering from blood pressure and many other things that do directly are initiated or are exacerbated by the drugs that they were given in the first place to control their heart or the medicine for the heart, right?
Yeah, you have a very valid point as well, and it's still in line with that. How I concur with what you just said, for sure. But however, uh, the ability to understand the side effect, at least many drugs, we understand the side effects, despite the fact that we can prescribe them for, let's say, for headache or some other reasons. But we know that, oh, this particular drug, for instance, paracetamol, acetaminophen, that's Tylenol, acetaminophen. You also understand that the way you can, if you take them, it could affect, let's say, the liver, and it can also lead to kidney failure, especially if you take high doses of them. So these are, at least some of these things are well known, and that's part of the argument about, yeah, about just like the second aspect that talked about, the third bullet point talks about the traditional practices lack adequate scientific rigor, and for instance, blah blah blah. It's just basically talking about, yeah, we understand let's say the physician is believed to understand the side effects of most drugs or many drugs, but the African healers, it's argued that they do not even understand the side effects of many drugs, and they may treat particular symptoms as, oh, whenever someone has a headache, maybe the person had, let's say, malaria, for instance, or a particular ailment. So that's the argument, which is, yeah, to some extent true, but not 100% true. Right?
Yeah. Just sounds very Eurocentric in nature, especially for the second point. A lot of the reasons why it's perceived that they don't have adequate knowledge over their own compositions as regulatory bodies, pharmaceutical bodies that would impose those regulations are biomedical. So if you're, like Cydia was saying, coming with a holistic treatment and just abide by the regulations, they won't absorb you or let you into their regulatory kind of like practices. So I don't know if it's as much as like they don't have an understanding. It just seems as though that knowledge is localized within their own communities rather than like them not having a knowledge of your competition.
Yeah, what you say is correct. But however, I'm saying it, these are the arguments that have been thrown out. So obviously, this argument comes from the Eurocentric lens, for sure. So I think maybe I missed out that part, but for sure it came from a Eurocentric lens. But these are part of the arguments that have been used to discredit the traditional healing therapies or traditional therapies. I don't know if you got that. Okay. Yeah, and also about even the aspect of hoarding knowledge. I believe that, oh, this belief that the knowledge is esoteric, that is supernatural, some believe that it's passed on from a supernatural being. They say that a family, let's say healing a particular condition runs from in the family. And a good example is something like, and I remember back home in Nigeria, especially from where I come from in Nigeria, there's this belief that healing, let's say, people with psychiatric condition, ability to heal such conditions runs in a particular family. So the father will pass it on to, let's say, mostly the son anyway, as often the practice. But I have a friend back home who their father was the one who was treating people with psychiatric condition, and he passed it on also to the children. And the same thing applied to some other condition, even stroke and conditions like that. So that's the perception that despite the fact that people can actually learn this thing if they are given the opportunity to learn, but because of the way they hoard knowledge and they just want to, they frame it as if it's an esoteric knowledge, whereas this is something that they pass on to their children, and they say, oh, healing this kind of condition runs in this family or in that other family. Let's say healing stroke treatment. Let's say one will say, oh, stroke treatment runs in Jamal's family. Another will say, oh, healing psychiatric condition runs in Asante's family, and just like that. And that's the kind of how it's been done over time. And that's also part of the argument that no, this knowledge shouldn't be, because of the way it's framed as esoteric knowledge, as something supernatural. Yeah, they find fault in it, that the knowledge should be made more open for people to learn. But with the current way that it's being run, or that it calls for concern. So they hoard the knowledge. So they believe that, yeah, so this practice shouldn't be mainstream, shouldn't be it should be reimagined. And then the another part is about it being outdated. Also believe that, yeah, because of that the knowledge, yeah, the traditional practices are outdated. It's not at par with the current um scientific way of um advancements. And then lastly, about lack of regulation. Unlike we're talking about a regulated profession, and someone who may just open such practices, maybe bring some herbs together and sell. There's not been proper regulation. Well, I think right now is beginning to change. I think I've come across a paper that I can remember the paper right now that talked about the regulation of traditional healing methods. So, but these are some of the arguments that have been laid or that have been made in a bid to kick against or invalidate or delegitimize the traditional healing practices. And then, however, an important part is about, yeah, traditional healing methods can actually coexist. It can actually coexist with the contemporary orthodox medicine. It can actually coexist. It can coexist because even right now, we also understand that, for instance, back home anyway, in Nigeria, I know many persons still approach traditional healers. Even there are some conditions that are believed. So, for instance, that my friend I was talking about, the one that his father did had a traditional healing, should I call it business, where they treated people that had psychiatric conditions. People still come to the place. There are also some kind of poisons, so poisonous substances that one might ingest. And but coming to that place, the person would vomit it out and receive some drugs or some traditional herbs that would help to restore or reset the system. And that's what they do. And funny enough, some of these, in some cases, but especially back home in Nigeria, some of these diseases, some of these poisonous substances, the orthodox medicine has not been very potent in addressing them. There are cases, although anecdotal, that I've heard about, where someone treat, went to reported to a hospital and had some conditions. With the diagnosis that was done, they were not able to detect what actually happened to the person. But when those individuals were taken to the traditional healers, they detected that, the person ingested some sort of poison, no substance, and then they were able to treat that individual and they bounced back to full health. So also kind of the point that the orthodox healing method is not omniscient. It has its limits. So traditional healing methods also plays an important role, both as complementary to orthodox medicine, or probably both of them are complementary for each other. So, and then there are also some areas, for instance, the Himori and Ogunode, I hope I pronounced the name correctly. So they also argued that there are, even in traditional healing practices, that there are areas of specialization. For instance, there are those who are specialists in obstetric care. There are those who are specialists in gynecological care. There are those who are specialists in psychiatry and general practitioners as well. Even like the one I talked about, that my friend whose father specialized in traditional psychiatric care. So some of these specializations exist even in the traditional system. So trying to understand that, yeah, whereas the orthodox westernized medicine system has these areas of specialization, we also have such practices or such systems in the traditional system. So that's like the argument by the authors. So there are some conditions like here, this quote I just lifted it that talks about, oh, there are cultural and spiritual health problems such as infertility, protracted labor in women, medically incurable souls, mental ailments, stroke, unabated bleeding, piles or hemorrhoid, etc., whose solutions are beyond the realm of orthodoxy. That are still trying to help. Yeah, we understand that the orthodox medicine is very important and helpful, but it still has its limits. And then traditional approaches then comes in to complement or assist. Even up to right now, even the paper also pointed out that the despite the mainstream acceptance of orthodox medical practices, the traditional methods still receive much patronage. They have not been run out of business. People still patronize them, and they are still booming. So the bottom line is that, yeah, we understand the Eurocentric approaches. We also understand the traditional approaches. We understand that each of them have their limits. Each of them also has their benefits. So the best way should probably be about how do we ensure that we integrate and introduce a system that is complementary, that ensures that people can access both or they can work together. There are papers from the, I have a physiotherapy background, I've told you before. There are papers and also there are programs where people have suggested models where both the traditional bone setters worked closely with orthopedics doctors and physiotherapists. Because to date, these traditional healers or bone setters or whatever we call them, different times, we use different times for them. So they still receive high patronage. Very importantly, like you had here, they are easy to access, they are cheap. They are cheap. So big people believe because they are cheaper, so people want to access them. And because people believe that, oh, there are some anecdotal stories or evidence where people have talked about, yeah, that in the hospital, the doctor said that their foot, let's say they had a condition, sort of orthopedic condition, and in the hospital, the doctor said that they will be amputated, and they refused. No, they don't want to be amputated. And they went back home and eventually went to see a traditional healer, and eventually the leg was salvaged. I've heard these stories. I've heard people tell these stories. I don't know how true it is, but at least I've heard the stories. So basically, but I also heard stories where even as in my practice as a physiotherapist back home in Nigeria, I've also had people who came to the clinic or to the hospital. They saw they were receiving care from traditional healers, and the conditions, the fact that they developed very serious complications, to the extent that when they arrived to the hospital, there was limited, what we could do was limited. And in some instances, we were also able to help to salvage the situation. So these things exist. So the model now is about how we can create a referral pathway or a collaborative pathway or system where both mainstream orthodox practitioners and the traditional practitioners are able to collaborate, able to refer, able to brainstorm, and able to work closely to provide the public good, which is about providing good quality and effective care to the people, to the patients. Okay, Sylvia.
I think from that aspect, we highlighted that healing has happened through the history of humanity.
Yeah.
Right? There were instances of bones that were, there is a skeleton somewhere, I don't remember exactly where it shows that this person had a fracture and it was cared for. Right? It's one of these like first humans that ever roamed the earth, and it shows that they were cared for by someone. So caring and healing, it is as old as humanity itself. It's just that this Eurocentric way of healing has been sort of because of the way that colonization happened, has taken, the position of like the mainstream way of healing. I do have a little sort of like a question to you.
Okay.
Is it, in my belief, in my world, although, like, for example, traditional healing in Colombia and biomedical medicine still struggle very much to coexist within the system. Because it's really, it is not held with respect, right? It exists and a lot of people have access to that, not because it's cheaper, but because it's much more accessible. Asking for a doctor's appointment or to see any doctor in Colombia can take months, where you can just walk into this person's house and you will be seen within, you know, the same day or a few hours and all of that. But so what can we do as public health professionals in order to sort of give more visibility to it when those that are practicing medicine really hold no regard for traditional medicine?
Yeah, I think that's a very important policy. That question has it has a very important policy implications for sure. So I think that's something that should be addressed, approach from the policy lines and from the people at the policy table. Yeah, because they set the guidelines, they set the standards, even policies at different levels. There are policies at the clinical practice levels, there are policies at the administrative levels, and there are policies at the health system levels. Yeah, but I think something like that should actually come from the health system level, where it's been, let's say, it's established that, yeah, when it comes to this type of practice, the practitioners from here and from this, let's say, orthopedic surgeon, for instance, should recognize that there are some benefits to the traditional healing methods for certain orthopedic conditions. So basically, there could be a policy that, yeah, when these kind of conditions are presented, that this is what should happen, and these are what should happen. So, but I think it's not easy to change that if there is no concerted policy intervention to be like, oh, this is the procedure, or these are the procedures for certain scenarios or certain conditions. Let's say in the case of cancer screening, be like, oh, if someone reports for cancer, it should be done, this other thing should be done. Maybe there are some cancers, this is just hypothetical. Maybe there are some cancers that have some traditional healers have been able to, let's say, treat some of the symptoms. So, and let's say perhaps the orthodox practitioners are not able to address such symptoms. Let's say, that could be a way for collaboration. Be like, oh, in such case, this kind of cases, these traditional healers should come in and do this, whereas the orthodox practitioners should come in and do this other thing. So I think that's where the policymakers can come in and do something about it, lay down the procedures or the policies. Yeah. So right now I just wanted to also I just wanted to ask here, what are I wanted this to be a group activity before, but because of time, I'll just read open to everyone. So which approaches to resistance did you identify from this? Talking about orthodoxy and traditional or indigenous healing approaches. This whole thing that we talked about right now. Which approaches to resistance did you identify from the anyone? Okay.
Compared to, this is from like last week's reading, I guess, but compared to this week's reading, when it talks about approaches to resistance, where there's individual acts of resistance versus which can lead up to like collective resistance. In this case, I feel like the resistance is more of a reactionary approach towards Eurocentric views, and how with transitioning into an era of or post-disruption of African ways of knowledge, the resistance comes by continuing to utilize those methods in order to kind of maintain that African identity in healthcare.
Yeah, okay.
I would say there's like a mix of like the avoidance. I'm sorry, just to answer your question. There's like a mix of the avoidance and the constructive, because even in Nigeria today, although traditionalists are not, shouting from the rooftop that they're still using these traditional ways of healing, but it's still prevalent. People would still, use them in the villages and stuff. So I think there's just still like ways of resisting, but in a more southern way. So that would correspond to the avoidant framework. And then I said C as well, which was the constructive one, which is again still creating these alternatives within the mainstream systems where people are still believing in this in conclaves of society. So
Yeah, I agree, especially that constructive aspect. That because they are creating alternatives. Even for instance, people of the low socioeconomic income status, individuals, they are more likely to access these traditional healing methods because they may not have the resources to approach, especially in a situation or society where most people pay out of pocket for healthcare, and they will obviously want to utilize the avenues that are easier to, they have easier access to, that they can pay for or they can afford. So that's that alternative that has been created, at least caters to a part of the constituencies.
sorry, just
Okay.
I think one thing that stood out to me is how Africans, like we sort of also co-opted this two-eyed seeing I guess framework that indigenous peoples have, where it's like a mixture of like Afrocentric and indigenous ways of knowing. Because you would even see, for example, in Nigeria, people would go to the hospitals but still go to like those like traditional. So it's like they understand this mix of both and just, whichever one's able to heal me. And I believe these two things work, and they still, dip their toes in two ways. So that was one, I guess, theme that I was able to identify.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it was the Cooper view about the acts of resistance that Black women each and everybody about, and like one of the approaches to resistance, like the everyday resistance, where it was just like small acts of resistance through doing work at a slower pace or talking back or like slowly damaging property. Of course, there was also like the overt resistance where you have like this like permanent escape or like violence, things like that. But I think there's like something almost, I don't know, it's kind of bittersweet, like sad, but also amazing about the small acts of resistance where you were just doing whatever you could control, like what little you had in your control, you were slowly resisting. And I think obviously that leads, like it binds together to create the larger resistance that obviously gave way to freedom. So I felt like those, like the everyday forms of resistance is one that just like really stuck with me, because in a time where everything you're doing is controlled and you had like no freedom, there were still these little acts of resisting. And I thought that was just like, just thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was actually talking about the healing aspect.
Yeah. And I think that's something that even stands in today, like a lot of people who are in corporate offices or maybe like toxic work environments where there's anti-Black racism, they'll do these like small acts of resistance. So even just like comparing what's still relevant from before to now and how like the different levels of resistance are all meaningful, like no matter if it's huge or small.
Thank you. So basically, so I think we'll take a break and then go into the second, which is about the actual reading for today. But basically, I used this to capture, like the title I had was meant to help us to understand the main theme but apart from that, it's also about trying to weld or integrate the traditional and and Western therapies. That's the idea. That's what one of the major things. Trying is maybe to try to weld both, helping us understand that both are valid and both are legitimate and both can be complementary and both can be used to ensure that the dignity of the Black person is maintained, and also our ingenuity is preserved. Ensure that we have legitimate ways, we're competent, we're able to devise and introduce or develop technologies or methods and approaches or therapies that can help us, and as well as also understanding our own aspect of doing things, but also understanding we're in an ever-evolving world, and we can also learn from others and then adapt it to a certain. So the Western approach or approaches are very relevant also, but we need to adapt them in a way that is culturally suitable, culturally appropriate for the Black population. You want to say something?
Not sure if this is a theme, but
Okay.
something that came to mind is how the Western model isn't easily adaptable based on context, and something that came up in a couple of like the fish reading and the ecological histories is that healing can be found in your environment and is connected to your environment. And that connection between human and environmental health isn't something that Western medicine found until like more recently.
That's ecological. Yeah. History, yeah, true. All right, guys. So we'll take a break now and we'll return in 15, that was 11:30.
Is it just one break for this class?
Yeah.